Hi, everyone, and welcome to Gendering Geopolitics, my series where I have quick 10-minute conversations with women who are doing amazing work around the world. My name is Emily Prey, and I'm a senior analyst at the New Lines Institute in Washington, D.C. And today I'm joined by Dr. Beth Van Schaack, the former deputy to the ambassador at large for war crimes, and Leah Kaplan, visiting professor in human rights at Stanford Law School. Thank you so much for joining me. It is a pleasure to have you here. So today we're going to be discussing genocide determinations in the US. So is there an official genocide determination process within the government at the moment?
There is not. There obviously are steps that get taken, and this includes a very large interdepartmental discussion within the State Department, but also an interagency discussion with other executive branch entities. It's driven largely by a combination of mild office, the Office of Global Criminal Justice, the regional desk, which is really the custodian of the bilateral relationship and has a kind of a 50,000-foot view of all the different equities at play vis-a-vis a particular country or government. The Legal Advisor's Office, and then other interested offices, including sometimes the White House that may be more or less forward-leaning when it comes to this type of determination. But there's no formal process that gets triggered, for example, through legislation or through a protocol that's been established.
So the US has historically overwhelmingly determined genocide when there have been instances of mass killing, but we know that genocidal acts are incredibly gendered, and there's an immense targeting of women and women's reproductive systems in genocide. So is the US willing to understand the gender dimensions of genocide, and are they ready to act and determine genocide based off of these other acts listed under Article 2 in the Genocide Convention beyond mass killing?
There's no question that the idea of genocide really is tied to the vision of mass killing. That's the colloquial understanding of the term. And for people who are not familiar with the text of the Genocide Convention or with some of the jurisprudence that emerged, for example, out of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in the famous Akayesu case, I think people land on mass killing as the equivalent of genocide, and then they sort of understand it to mean maybe against only certain groups or some showing of a heightened intent to destroy the group in whole or in part. But as you know, if you read the Genocide Convention carefully, there's two types of genocide that standing alone could constitute genocide, even absent mass killing. And this includes hindering the reproductive capacity of women. And then the Akayesu case took that a step further and said sexual violence directed against a protected group, if done with the intent of destroying the group in whole or in part, can also constitute genocide, even if there isn't a reproductive goal or objective in mind. And so I think the Legal Advisor's Office, for example, or mild office, Global Criminal Justice, absolutely understands this. And the US government also has a Global Women's Issues Office that has been very active in situations in which women are being systematically persecuted, including potentially rising to the level of genocide. And so I think the government is willing to do that, but what normally is the sticking point in finding genocide is the question of intent, whether or not it can be shown that a government, for example, or a regime is acting or implementing a policy with the intent to destroy a protected group in whole or in part. And that's just much harder to prove from open source information, et cetera. Now, obviously, the US government has access to certain intelligence capabilities, which may have the ability to add some content and greater visibility into that intent. But that's often the sticking point. I don't think the problem is necessarily finding gendered violence invisible, for example.
In what way are genocide determinations politicized? Because I know that when, with regards to the Uyghur genocide, when Secretary of State Mike Pompeo determined that it was genocide on his last day of office, there was a lot of pushback against that.
Yeah, there is that risk, I think. And part of it depends on what you mean by politicized. If you mean by politicized that some element of the US government wants to ensure impunity or wants to protect a particular government, I think there is some risk of that over the years, potentially. But I think more likely what is happening is these relationships are very complex, and there may be other levers that are being used by various elements of the US government. And so they want to give those a time to work. As you can imagine, making a genocide determination is kind of a one-way street. It's really hard to revert to business as usual with respect to that government. And there may be counterterrorism issues or law enforcement issues or humanitarian concerns that the US government wants to be engaged with. And injecting that genocide determination could disrupt those other avenues of engagement. And so I don't think of that as necessarily politicization so much as it's a very complex determination. Now, you mentioned the Uyghur determination. Obviously, that persecution had reached, it's been ongoing for years, but had reached really acute levels starting in 2017. And we knew that there was a process underway under the Trump administration, and yet nothing emerged. And in fact, it was President Biden during the campaign that actually, in remarks at a campaign event that were then subsequently reinforced by a campaign spokesperson, made the determination or made the statement that he viewed the events there as genocide. And so it looked a little bit like the Trump administration felt that they had to then kind of jump on a bandwagon that had already left the station. I'm mixing my metaphors, but you get my point. And then to do it on the last day of office felt a little bit like, as I've said in other remarks, a kind of a poison pill. Like, all right, we're going to make the determination, we're going to do the right thing, and then we're going to hand you the mess, and we're going to let you have to now fix it, Biden administration. And so, the timing of that seemed really problematic, especially given what we know about all the data that was emerging in 2017, 18, 19, clearly showing that a genocide was underway, or at least an incipient genocide. There were enough warning signs that merited a greater determination and a greater attention to the issue.
So we have a situation, again, with the Uyghur genocide, where there was an Economist article that came out where the State Department's legal advisor's office were saying that it wasn't necessarily genocide, or we didn't have enough information or evidence, but 2 secretaries of states have determined that it's genocide. How is this something that can happen?
Well, the legal advisor's office obviously is going to be taking a very strict legal perspective. They're going to be looking at the elements of genocide, at the Genocide Convention, at the jurisprudence that has emerged. And I read that article. I think the article was quite ignorant in thinking about the whole scope of genocide and the different acts, as we've talked about earlier. It's not just the equivalent of mass killing or an extermination exercise. There's lots of ways to commit genocide, including slow death, which can result in genocide over many years, even generations. And so I think it evinced a fair amount of ignorance in that regard. I read the State Department legal advisor passage there to imply that the State Department legal advisor's office had not yet determined that there was enough information to conclude that it was a full-fledged genocide. And that may again have hinged on this idea of genocidal intent, that we had leaked documents, we have open source information, we have some survivor testimony, people in the diaspora, but together that mosaic may not quite have painted a full picture of genocidal intent. And so lawyers, I think, in these sorts of regards are going to be inherently somewhat more conservative than the policymakers. And this really turns on what is the standard that is required. And we don't have that determined yet necessarily. There's lots of different standards out there that get used in criminal courts, by commissions of inquiry, et cetera. And so what the standard is that the government feels it's operating under may hinge on how confident the legal advisor's office was in that genocide determination. But as you said, the Secretary of State, 2 secretaries of state felt confident. And then later, the Human Rights Bureau, which has great expertise in this area, also reinforced that determination in the annual Human Rights Report. And so it may just be a clash of standards and just of a kind of a more forward-leaning versus a more conservative ethos in making such a determination.
And so moving forward, how can we work to ensure that we have a uniform operative standard of proof on genocide determinations, and especially one that includes the gender dimensions of genocide?
I think there's a really important role here to play by advocacy organizations and organizations that have relationships with diaspora communities, survivor communities, even in the countries in question, even if they can't physically be present, if they have the ability to be in touch with those communities, to provide sources of information that cover the full gamut of the acts of genocide, that make sure to focus on the gender dimension of genocide. Because the US government is doing a million things at once, and these are very complex bilateral relationships. They may not have the ability to deploy a fully interdisciplinary team to do a full examination of the situation. And so they're looking at intelligence briefings, they're looking at what the press is covering, but they're also, I think, very open to receiving advocacy from organizations that are much closer to the events on the ground. And so I think that's a really key role for not just advocacy organizations, but academics who study these societies. We've seen some of the big studies that have come out about enforced sterilization in Xinjiang, for example. That was new information, and it was important information, and it really has the ability to affect the way in which these determinations play out.
Thank you so much for coming on Gendering Geopolitics. This was incredibly interesting, and I really appreciate your time.
It's wonderful. It's great to be here. I'm a big fan, and congratulations to all you're doing.
Thank you so much.